The town of Redemption was a place where hope came to die. It lay baked and broken under a merciless sun, a single dusty street, flanked by sun-bleached clapboard buildings that leaned against each other like weary drunks. Elias' heart moved through it, like a ghost, a tall, broad-shouldered man, whose silence was a wall built brick by brick from memory and loss. He had come for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, the mundane necessities that tethered him to a world he no longer felt a part of. He was tying the sacks to his saddle when the world shattered. Hooves thundered. Glass shattered. A woman screamed. The sounds were a language Elias knew too well. He didn't run towards it. He froze, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddlebag. From the entrance of the Redemption Bank and Trust, 3 masked men spilled out their movements, practiced and brutal. They weren't clumsy opportunists. They were soldiers executing a plan. The leader, a man who moved with the chilling grace of a predator, paused on the bank steps. His eyes, visible through the slits in his bandana, scanned the street, dismissing the cowering townsfolk with contempt. Then his gaze landed on Elias. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The man's stare was not one of recognition, but of purpose, as if Elias were a landmark on a map he had studied for years. Slowly, deliberately, the leader reached into his coat. He didn't draw a weapon. He produced a small object that glinted in the harsh sunlight. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the dusty boardwalk. It landed with a soft, metallic clink. Then he mounted his horse, and with his men vanished in a storm of dust and fading hoofbeats. For a long moment, no one moved. The dust settled, revealing the object lying alone in the stark afternoon light. It was an old tarnished silver locket, oval-shaped and etched with a pattern of climbing roses. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. His blood ran cold, a glacial torrent that froze him where he stood. He knew that locket. He had held it in his hand once before, slick with rain, and something darker beside the churning waters of a place called Black Creek. It was a relic from a day he had spent 2 decades trying to bury, a day he believed he had delivered righteous justice. But the man's eyes, the chilling precision of the act, this was no random echo of the past. It was a message. It was a summons. And it meant the ghosts of Black Creek were no longer content to haunt his dreams. They were coming for him. Elias's ranch was a testament to his solitude. Tucked away in a shallow valley carved from granite and juniper, the cabin stood against the wind like a stubborn monument to grief. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. An empty rocking chair, its wood worn smooth by his late wife Sarah, sat beside the hearth. On the mantelpiece, the carved initials S.H. and L.H. were a daily flagellation, a reminder of the fever that had stolen his wife and daughter in the same brutal winter 3 years ago. His life was a ritual of chores and silence, a penance for a past he couldn't outrun and a future he didn't want. He had become the land itself, weathered quiet and carved by time. It was into this carefully constructed tomb that they stumbled, apparitions of a life he had long since forsaken. Mary Alden and her son Jaime appeared at his fence line, not as travelers, but as refugees from a world that had stripped them of everything but the breath in their lungs. The boy, barely 10, stood before his mother with the rigid posture of a soldier, his small hands balled into fists, his jaw set against a hunger that had long since become a constant companion. Mary, her face a roadmap of hardship, looked as if one more gust of wind might scatter her to dust. When she knocked, the sound was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred quiet. Elias opened the door to find them there, framed by the unforgiving landscape. His first instinct was to close it, to preserve the sanctity of his isolation. But then he saw the boy. Jaime's eyes wide and dark, held a weariness that no child should ever know. They were the same eyes that had looked up at him from his daughter Lily's sickbed, pleading for a comfort he could not give. "We don't want trouble." Mary's voice was a dry rasp, cracking with exhaustion and pride. "I've got a boy. He's hungry. We don't ask for much." Elias's gaze dropped from her face to the boy, then back again. The wall inside him, so carefully maintained, began to crumble. The memories the locket had resurrected in town now collided with the ghosts standing on his porch. "You got nothing?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "Nothing but your boy," he clarified when she looked confused. She nodded slowly, the movement an admission of utter defeat. "That's right." He opened the door wider, stepping back into the shadows of the cabin. The warmth from the hearth washed over them, a shocking comfort after so many nights spent in the cold. Jaime stepped inside without hesitation, his cautious eyes taking in the simple, clean room. Mary followed, her body trembling with a relief so profound it was painful. Elias said little, preparing a simple stew and fresh water, his movements economical and sure. He watched them eat, watched the boy close his eyes as the first spoonful of warmth hit his mouth, and felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his own sorrow. As Mary recounted a fractured version of their story, a dead husband lost work towns that offered no kindness, Elias didn't press for details. He saw the truth in the hollows of her cheeks and the frayed hem of her dress. That night, he gave Jaime a cot in the corner, a small act of charity that felt monumental. As the boy slept, his small hand clinging to the blanket, as if it were a life raft, Mary sat by the fire, her stillness a portrait of exhaustion. "You'll need work," Elias said, breaking the long silence. "I can do anything," she replied instantly. "I've done laundry, cleaned barns." "I didn't mean for me." He interrupted, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I meant for your heart. You've been carrying too much alone." The words hung in the air, simple and unadorned, but they struck Mary with the force of a physical blow. She had been seen. In that moment, the quiet, grieving man before her offered not just shelter, but a space for her sorrow to rest alongside his. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a shared language of loss, a foundation upon which something fragile and unexpected might begin to grow. The boy's presence was a constant, bittersweet echo of his lost Lily, and Mary's quiet resilience mirrored the strength he had so admired in Sarah. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. The illusion of peace lasted less than a week. It was shattered by the arrival of a man on a fine black mare, a man who didn't look like he belonged in the dust and rock of the territory. He wore a tailored city coat and polished boots, and his smile was a cold, practiced thing. He reined in his horse a polite distance from the porch where Elias was mending a harness. "Mr. Hart," the man's voice was smooth as oiled leather. Elias didn't stop his work. He merely looked up, his expression unreadable. "Who's asking?" "A messenger," the man said, dismounting with an easy grace. He didn't approach the porch. "I come on behalf of Mr. Sutton. He asked me to convey a message." Elias's hand stilled. Sutton. The name was a venomous whisper from a past he had tried to outrun. This wasn't about a forged deed or a forgotten debt. The locket had been the prelude. This was the first verse of a song he never wanted to hear again. The messenger's smile widened, sensing he had struck a nerve. He didn't mention land or money. He didn't need to. He leaned against his horse and spoke the words that were meant to flay Elias open. "Mr. Sutton says the debt from Black Creek is coming due." The name landed like a hammer blow. Black Creek. It wasn't a place on a map. It was a scar on his soul. Mary, who had stepped quietly onto the porch, saw the change in Elias. The weary rancher vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. The U.S. Marshal he had once been rose from the grave he dug for it, his eyes turning the color of a winter storm. "There is no debt," Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Mr. Sutton seems to believe otherwise," the envoy countered, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. His gaze flickered past Elias to Mary and Jaime, who now stood half-hidden in the doorway. "He is a man who believes all accounts must be settled, one way or another." The veiled threat was as sharp as a blade. Elias rose slowly to his feet, the leather harness falling to the porch with a soft thud. He was taller than the messenger, wider, and the quiet grief that usually hung about him had been replaced by an aura of lethal stillness. "You can ride back to your master," Elias said, his voice a low growl that carried on the wind. "You tell Sutton that if he wants to settle accounts, he can come here himself. But he should know. I buried Black Creek once. I'll have no trouble burying it again." The envoy's smile finally faltered. He saw not a farmer, but a man who understood violence intimately. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like gunpowder smoke. Elias turned his face a mask of stone and met Mary's frightened eyes. The fight he had been running from his entire life had finally found his doorstep, and it had brought the ghosts of his past with it. This was not about land. This was a reckoning. The envoy's visit poisoned the fragile peace of the ranch. The air grew thick with unspoken dread. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow at dusk looked like a man with a gun. Elias began to move with a renewed purpose, a grim efficiency that Mary had not seen before. He spent a day cleaning his firearms, the rhythmic click-clack of metal on metal, a somber percussion that underscored their new reality. He walked the perimeter of his property, not as a landowner, but as a soldier surveying a battlefield, his eyes scanning for vulnerabilities, for firing lines, for any advantage the land might offer. The first overt act of aggression came 3 nights later. Elias woke to the smell of something acrid on the night air, a chemical tang that cut through the clean scent of pine and dust. He was out of the cabin in an instant, rifle in hand, moving with a silent, predatory grace. Mary, woken by his sudden departure, watched from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. By the light of a slivered moon, Elias saw them 2 figures crouched by the stone well that was the ranch's lifeblood. They were pouring a dark liquid from a heavy canister into the water. Poison. It was a coward's attack meant not to confront, but to annihilate, to make the land itself uninhabitable. Rage cold and pure surged through Elias, but the marshal in him tempered it with icy control. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't fire a shot into the air. He melted into the shadows circling around the side of the barn, using the terrain he knew like the back of his own scarred hand. He came upon them from behind a specter of vengeance emerging from the darkness. "I'd advise you to stop." His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cracked the night silence like a whip. The 2 men spun around, their faces pale with shock. One fumbled for a pistol, but he never cleared the holster. In 2 swift strides, Elias was on him. He brought the butt of his rifle down in a sharp, disabling arc against the man's wrist, the crack of bone sickeningly loud in the stillness. The man screamed and crumpled, clutching his shattered hand. The second man, seeing the feral intensity in Elias's eyes, dropped his own weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Elias disarmed them with brutal efficiency, his movements economical and precise. He was no longer the grieving farmer. He was the lawman he had once been, a figure of uncompromising authority. He bound their hands with rope from the barn and marched them to their horses. "This is your one and only warning." Elias set his voice a low growl as he shoved the uninjured man toward his saddle. You will take your friend, and you will ride back to Sutton. You will tell him that the next men he sends to my land will be buried on it. Do you understand me?" The man, trembling, could only nod. "Now get out of my sight." He watched them gallop away into the darkness, a wounded man slouched over his saddle, before he turned his attention back to the well. He worked until dawn, hauling up bucket after bucket of tainted water, his face a grim mask of determination. Mary brought him coffee as the sun began to paint the eastern sky, her expression a mixture of fear and awe. She had seen the protector, the fighter, the man capable of the controlled violence necessary to keep them safe. "You were a marshal," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty hand. He looked at the poisoned well, at the home he had nearly lost, and then at her. "I was," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of that admission. "A long time ago." "What happened at Black Creek?" she asked softly. He was silent for a long moment, the sounds of the waking wilderness filling the space between them. "I killed a man," he said finally, his gaze distant. "An outlaw named Jonathan Blackwood. The territory called it justice. They gave me a commendation." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a pain that went deeper than grief. "I'm starting to think they were wrong." The confession hung in the air, a stark and terrible revelation. The threat they faced was not just from a greedy landowner, but from the very foundations of Elias Hart's past. And Mary knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was a fight that could only end in blood. The land wasn't the prize. It was the battlefield for a war that had begun 20 years ago. The failed attack on the well forced Elias's hand. He could no longer afford to be reactive. He had to understand the enemy who was hunting him. Leaving Mary and Jaime was a risk, but staying put in ignorance was a greater one. He spent a day fortifying the cabin, showing Mary how to use the rifle, where to watch from, and how to barricade the door. He taught Jaime how to set snares not for animals, but as warning bells using tin cans and twine. The boy absorbed every lesson with a somber intensity, his childhood eroding with each passing hour. "I'll be back in 3 days," Elias promised, his hand briefly resting on Jaime's shoulder. "Stay off the main path. Trust no one." He rode west, not towards redemption, but towards the old county seat of Shiloh, a town that held the territory's dusty and forgotten records. He was chasing a ghost, and his only lead was a name Sutton. He discovered quickly that the name was a fabrication. There was no powerful landowner named Sutton in the territorial registries. The man was a phantom operating through intermediaries and shell companies. But Elias was a patient man, and he knew how the law worked both on the page and in the shadows. He spent a day poring over land deeds and transfer logs, tracing the ownership of every parcel of land surrounding the old Black Creek territory. A pattern emerged. Over the past 5 years, a single mysterious buyer had been acquiring all of it, paying well over market value, consolidating the entire region under one unseen hand. His next stop was the home of Judge Alistair Finch, the retired magistrate who had signed the warrant for Jonathan Blackwood all those years ago. Finch was an old man now, his memory clouded by age and whiskey, but his eyes lit up with a flicker of recognition at the sight of Elias. "Hart, by God, I thought you were dead," the old judge rasped, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. "Not yet," Judge Elias said, accepting the drink. "I'm here about the Black Creek case. Jonathan Blackwood." Finch swirled the whiskey in his glass, his gaze distant. "Blackwood," he mused. "Vicious piece of work, as I recall. Ran with a nasty crew, robberies, murder. We were glad to see the end of him. You did the territory a service that day, Marshal." "Did I?" Elias pressed. "Were you ever sure of his guilt? Truly sure?" The judge hesitated, his rheumy eyes clouding with uncertainty. The evidence was compelling. His partners testified against him, said he was the ringleader, the one who pulled the trigger on that stagecoach guard. It seemed straightforward. He took a long drink. But there was always something that bothered me. After you brought him down, his partners vanished. Just gone. And the money from their last robbery never recovered. Not a single dollar. It was always assumed Blackwood had hidden it somewhere near the creek. He looked at Elias, a question in his eyes. Why are you digging this up after all this time? His son found me, Elias said grimly. Finch's face paled. He had a boy, didn't he? Just a little one. The pieces began to click into place. A hidden fortune, vanished partners, and a son left with nothing but a legacy of shame and a burning need for revenge. Elias now knew who Sutton was. He wasn't a businessman. He was an heir seeking to reclaim a tainted inheritance and settle a blood debt. While Elias chased the ghosts of his past, Mary and Jaime fought for a semblance of a future. They worked from sunup to sundown, turning the hard-scrabble patch of dirt beside the cabin into a small garden. Mary used the end of a broken shovel to turn the soil, her hands raw and blistered. Jaime hauled water from the now clean well, his small frame straining with the effort. They planted the few precious seeds Mary had carried with her: carrots, beans, squash. It was an act of defiant hope, a declaration that they intended to put down roots in this place. They were no longer guests. They were inhabitants fighting for every inch of their newfound home. One afternoon, as Mary was mending one of Jaime's shirts with thread unraveled from her own hem, the boy looked up from the book of blank pages Elias had given him. "Ma," he said quietly, "is Mr. Hart a good man?" Mary paused, the needle hovering in midair. She looked at the sturdy cabin, the clean well, the garden that held the promise of food. She thought of the quiet kindness in Elias's eyes and the fierce protectiveness he had shown them. "He is a good man who has had to do bad things, Jaime," she answered honestly. "And I think he's been paying for them ever since." The small garden, with its tender green shoots pushing through the stubborn earth, became a symbol of everything they were fighting for. It wasn't just about land. It was about the right to build a life, to nurture something out of nothing, and to defend it from the shadows that sought to tear it all down. Elias sent a message ahead, a simple, unsigned note delivered by a freight driver requesting a meeting. He named the saloon in Shiloh a neutral ground where a man could talk without having to watch his back every second. He knew Sutton would come. The game had gone on long enough. It was time for the players to see each other's faces. He arrived first, taking a table in the corner, the one with a clear view of the door and a solid wall behind him. The habits of a marshal died hard. He ordered a whiskey he didn't intend to drink and waited. The air in the saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer sawdust and cheap perfume. It was the scent of his former life, and it settled uncomfortably in his lungs. Sutton entered precisely at the appointed hour, moving through the room with an air of detached superiority. His fine coat, a stark contrast to the worn denim and stained leather of the other patrons. He wasn't alone. A hulking man with dead eyes and a pistol holstered high on his hip followed a step behind him, a loyal shadow named Cale. Sutton dismissed him with a flick of his wrist, and the man took up a sentinel's post by the door. Marshal Hart Sutton said, his voice smooth and laced with contempt, as he sat down opposite Elias. "Or should I say, Farmer Hart, it's hard to tell which lie you prefer these days." "My name is Elias," he replied, his voice level. "And yours is Thaddeus Blackwood." The name hit its mark. For a fraction of a second, the mask of cool composure slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, youthful anger in the man's eyes. He recovered quickly, a cold smile touching his lips. "So the old dog still has a few tricks," Thaddeus said. I confess I'm impressed. It took you longer than I expected to piece it together. Your father's partners disappeared after he died, Elias stated, laying the facts out, like cards on the table. So did the money. You've spent the last 5 years buying every piece of land around Black Creek. You're not after my ranch. You're looking for what you think he left behind. Thaddeus leaned forward, his smile turning into a sneer. The theatrical civility was gone, replaced by a venom that had been simmering for 2 decades. What he left behind? He left behind a shamed name. A wife who drank herself into an early grave, and a son who was passed from one uncaring relative to the next. He left me with nothing but the whispers that followed me everywhere I went. That's the son of Jonathan Blackwood, the murderer. His voice dropped to a raw, trembling whisper, the sound of a wound that had never healed. You didn't just kill a man that day, Hart. You executed my father in a muddy creek bed and called it justice. But it wasn't justice. It was an assassination. Elias felt the floor shift beneath him. Your father was a wanted man. He drew on me. A lie. Thaddeus slammed his fist on the table, making the whiskey glass jump. The saloon went quiet, all eyes turning to their table. My father was framed. His partners, the men you let walk away, set him up to take the fall. They fed you the story you wanted to hear, and you swallowed it whole because it was easier than doing your job. He was trying to surrender when you shot him down. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards. His eyes burned with the fire of absolute conviction. You took everything from me, Marshall. My father, my mother, my name. And then you had the audacity to build a life, a home, a family. You built your peace on my family's grave. The accusation struck Elias with the force of a physical blow, cracking the very foundation of his identity. For 20 years, the memory of Black Creek had been a source of grim pride, a difficult but necessary act of law and order. It was the cornerstone of his career as a marshal. Now Thaddeus Blackwood was telling him that his greatest act of justice was in fact his most terrible sin. I won't rest until I have taken everything from you, just as you did from me. Thaddeus vowed, his voice ringing with chilling certainty. The land is just the beginning. I will tear down your home, scatter your new family to the winds, and leave you with nothing but the silence and the ghosts. Some debts are paid in blood, Marshal, and yours is long overdue. He turned and strode out of the saloon, leaving Elias sitting alone in the sudden, deafening quiet. The fight was no longer about a deed or hidden fortune. It was personal. It was a battle for the truth of the past and the soul of the future. And Elias was no longer certain which side he was on. The ghost of Jonathan Blackwood now sat at the table with him, and his hollow eyes were asking for a justice Elias had denied him 20 years ago. The confrontation in Shiloh transformed the conflict. It was no longer a campaign of intimidation. It was now an open war. Thaddeus Blackwood, armed with wealth, influence, and a righteous fury, escalated his attack by turning the law itself into a weapon. Within a week, a territorial marshal, a man with a tin star and a greedy glint in his eye, clearly on Sutton's payroll, rode into redemption with a freshly minted warrant. The charges were a fiction woven from half-truths, obstruction of illegal property seizure, assault on private agents, and most damningly, harboring known fugitives. Thaddeus had twisted Mary and Jamie's desperate flight from poverty into a criminal act, branding them vagrants who had fled a court order in another county, a ruling that had been bought and paid for after they had already left. Elias was now a wanted man. Mary and Jaime were his alleged accomplices. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. They were trapped, cut off from town, with the very system Elias had once sworn to uphold now arrayed against them. There was nowhere to run, The only option left was to stand and fight. "He's using the law to make his war look clean," Elias explained grimly, as they gathered around the hearth that night, the warrant lying on the table between them like a coiled snake. Mary traced the official seal with a trembling finger. "They'll come hear the law." "They'll come," Elias confirmed. "Thaddeus, the corrupt marshal he's hired, and a posse of men who'll be told they're doing their civic duty. They'll expect us to surrender, or to run." Jaime, who had been listening silently, looked up at Elias, his young face set with a resolve that broke his mother's heart. "But we're not going to, are we?" "No, son," Elias said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're not." The days that followed were a frantic race against time. They transformed the ranch from a home into a fortress. Elias, drawing on decades of tactical knowledge, directed their efforts with grim precision. They dug a shallow trench along the northern approach, concealed by brush, offering a protected line of fire. They felled 2 large pines and dragged them across the main path, creating a formidable barricade that would force any riders to dismount and come on foot. Jaime, small and quick, was tasked with setting traps along the less obvious trail's tripwires, connected to a string of empty cans that would sound an alarm, and deep pits masked with branches and leaves. Mary worked tirelessly, stockpiling food and water in the storm cellar, reinforcing the cabin's shutters and tearing cloth into strips for bandages. Every action was a prayer, every task a small act of defiance. The work forged them into a single cohesive unit. The lines between them, grieving rancher, desperate widow, frightened boy, blurred and disappeared. They were a family bound not by blood, but by a shared purpose and a common enemy. In the evenings, exhausted and sore, they would sit together, the silence comfortable, their bond strengthening with each passing day. Elias saw in Mary a resilience that reminded him of the granite cliffs surrounding them, and in Jaime a courage that both inspired and worried him. One night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, its dark clouds mirroring the impending conflict, Elias took his old U.S. Marshal badge from a locked box. It was tarnished with age, the silver dulled the eagle's features worn smooth. He held it in the palm of his hand, and the weight of it both a comfort and a burden. Mary came and stood beside him. "You're not that man anymore, Elias," she said softly. He looked from the badge to her face, her features softened by the firelight. "Maybe not," he said. "But he's the one who has to see this through." He pinned the badge to the inside of his coat, hiding it from view. It wasn't for them. It was for him. A reminder of the man he had been and the man he needed to be one last time. They were ready. The ranch was as fortified as they could make it. Now all they could do was wait for the storm to break. The storm arrived with the posse. It rolled in from the west, a monstrous bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the sun and plunged the valley into a premature twilight. The wind howled, tearing at the junipers, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust to a slick, dark mud. Then came the thunder, a low, guttural roar that vibrated in their chests, a drumbeat for the violence to come. They appeared on the ridge like wraiths in the gloom. Thaddeus Blackwood, the corrupt Marshal Rourke, and a dozen deputized men, their slickers gleaming in the intermittent flashes of lightning. They advanced slowly, cautiously, their advance halted by the barricade of fallen trees. Elias' heart. Rourke's voice boomed, carried on the wind. "You are under arrest by the authority of the territory. Come out with your hands raised." From the cover of the trench, Elias watched them, his rifle resting on the earthen bank. "You've got no authority here, Rourke," he yelled back. "You're just Sutton's hired gun." A flash of lightning illuminated Thaddeus's face, contorted with hate. "This ends tonight, Hart," he screamed over the wind. "One way or another." The first shot was a deafening crack that blended with the thunder. The siege had begun. The fight was a chaotic ballet of shadows and light. Lightning strobed across the battlefield, freezing the action in stark, dramatic tableaus, a man falling, the flash of a muzzle, the terror in a horse's eyes. The rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the ground into a treacherous mire. Elias, Mary, and Jaime were hopelessly outgunned, but they had the advantage of terrain and preparation. The posse, forced to advance on foot, stumbled into their traps. The clatter of cans gave away a flanking maneuver. A man's scream signaled he had found one of the pits. Elias fired with methodical precision, his shots aimed to wound, to disable, to break their morale. Beside him, Mary reloaded a second rifle. Her movements deft and sure, her fear channeled into a focused calm. Jaime, sheltered behind the main cabin, acted as a spotter, his young eyes sharp, calling out enemy positions. But Thaddeus was relentless. He pushed his men forward, using their superior numbers to lay down a withering field of fire. Bullets splintered the wood of the cabin, thudding into the walls of the trench. They were being pinned down their position, slowly becoming untenable. "We have to fall back to the barn," Elias yelled over the din. "It's our last stand, go." He laid down covering fire as Mary and Jaime scrambled from the cabin, racing across the muddy yard towards the massive wooden structure. A bullet grazed Elias's shoulder, a hot, searing pain, but he ignored it, firing until the rifle was empty before sprinting after them. They slammed the heavy barn doors shut, just as the posse swarmed the yard. The barn became their final bastion. The roar of the storm outside was deafening, and the wind shrieking through the slats, the rain drumming a frantic tattoo on the tin roof. The air was thick with the smell of hay, animals, and fear. Lightning cast long, dancing shadows through the cavernous space. Then came a new smell: smoke. Thaddeus, in a fit of desperate rage, had ordered the barn set alight. Flames began to lick at the dry timber near the main door. The fire was a ticking clock. They were trapped in a burning, collapsing cage. The posse broke through a side door. The fight funneled inside a close-quarters, desperate struggle amidst the terrified lowing of cattle and the crackle of spreading flames. Marshal Rourke was the first through the door. He fell to a shot from Mary's pistol, his tin star no protection against her resolve. Amidst the chaos, Thaddeus found Elias. They collided near the hayloft, their personal war finally stripped down to two men in a burning building. "It's over, Hart," Thaddeus snarled, leveling his revolver. It was then that the secondary twist of fate, cruel and absolute, revealed itself. Cale Thaddeus's loyal shadow staggered into the light, clutching a mortal wound in his gut. He stumbled against a stall, his eyes wide with the clarity of a dying man. He was innocent. Thaddeus Cale choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. Thaddeus's attention snapped to his right-hand man. "What are you talking about?" "Your father, Jonathan." Cale gasped for air, his confession a desperate, ragged torrent. "It was us, the rest of the gang. We framed him. We took the money. And we told Hart he was the ringleader. I was there. I lied to the marshal. I've been lying to you. For years. Using your revenge to get my hands on the rest of the Blackwood assets." The confession struck Thaddeus Blackwood with the force of a lightning bolt. His entire life, his quest, his all-consuming hatred, it was all built on a lie. A lie told to him by the man who had stood by his side for years. His face, illuminated by the growing inferno, crumpled. The gun in his hand wavered. His lifelong quest for vengeance shattered in an instant, leaving him hollow and broken in the heart of the fire. Elias, seeing the utter devastation in the young man's eyes, didn't fire. The fight was over. The corrupt marshal was dead. The fire was raging. And the truth in all its terrible glory had finally come out. The remaining posse members, seeing their leaders fall and the barn about to collapse, threw down their weapons and surrendered. As a flaming beam crashed down from the roof, Elias grabbed the catatonic Thaddeus and dragged him along with Mary and Jamie out into the cleansing, violent rain. The rain-soaked dawn broke over a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering skeletal ruin, its black timbers stark against the soft gray light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of wet earth and ash. The honest deputies from the posse, their authority restored in the wake of Rourke's death, quietly took a catatonic Thaddeus Blackwood and his surrendered men into custody. Thaddeus offered no resistance. He moved like a man in a trance. His eyes vacant, the fire of his vengeance extinguished, leaving only cold, empty cinders. Elias, his shoulder bandaged by Mary, stood tall and gave his statement. With a clear head and a steady voice, he recounted everything: the arrival of Mary and Jaime, the threats, the siege, and most importantly, Cale's dying confession. He spoke not to save himself, but to set the record straight, to give Jonathan Blackwood the justice he had been denied in death, and to give his son Thaddeus a chance at a truth that might one day lead to peace. After the deputies departed with their prisoners, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The three of them stood together amidst the wreckage, survivors of a war they hadn't started, but had been forced to finish. Elias looked at Mary, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear and strong. He looked at Jaime, who stood beside his mother, no longer a frightened child, but a young man who had faced the fire and not flinched. The terror of the night had forged them, melting away all doubt and uncertainty, solidifying their bond into something as strong and enduring as the granite hills around them. Elias gently tended to a cut on Jaime's cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. Mary placed her hand on Elias's arm, a simple gesture of comfort and solidarity that spoke volumes. In the shared silence, they were not a rancher and his wards. They were a family scarred but unbroken. Months passed. The seasons turned. The scars on the land began to heal. With painstaking labor, they cleared the wreckage of the barn and began to build anew. Neighbors, hearing the true story of the siege, came with lumber and food, their quiet offerings a testament to the respect Elias had earned. The ranch, once a symbol of isolation and grief, became a place of community and rebirth. The small garden Mary had planted thrived, its bounty a splash of vibrant life against the scorched earth. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from the territorial capital, bearing an official seal. It confirmed that, based on Elias's testimony and further investigation, Jonathan Blackwood had been officially exonerated of the crimes for which he was killed. His name was cleared. The letter also stated that Thaddeus Blackwood, in light of the decades of manipulation he had endured, had been given a merciful sentence and would one day be a free man. Justice, true and complete, had finally been served. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the scorched earth in hues of rust and bruised violet, Elias, Mary, and Jaime stood together on the porch of their newly expanded home. The air was cool and still filled with the promise of peace. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the old tarnished U.S. Marshal badge. He looked at it for a long moment, the symbol of a past that had nearly destroyed him. Then he looked at Mary, her hand resting in his, and at Jaime, who smiled up at him. Quietly, he walked to the corner of the new foundation. He dug a small hole in the rich earth with his hands and placed the badge inside. As he covered it with soil, he was not just burying a piece of metal. He was burying the ghost of the marshal, letting go of the rigid law and relentless vengeance that had defined him. He was choosing mercy. He was choosing life. He returned to the porch and turned to Mary, his heart full of a feeling he thought he had lost forever. "Mary," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I once told you that you arrived with nothing but a boy. I was wrong. You brought everything. He took both her hands in his. Stay with me, not as a guest, not as a friend, as my wife. Tears welled in Mary's eyes, but her smile was as bright as the rising moon. Yes, Elias, she whispered. We'll build it together. He pulled her close, and with Jaime standing between them, they watched the last sliver of sun disappear, leaving the sky awash in stars. The silence was no longer a sign of loss, but a vessel for a future they would create together, finally at peace.